Few military victories in modern history seemed as improbable as Britain's reconquest of the Falkland Islands in 1982, when Margaret Thatcher dispatched a naval task force 8,000 miles across the Atlantic to retake remote islands that Argentina's military junta had seized, gambling that Britain would accept the loss rather than fight a war so far from home. Argentina's generals invaded the Falklands on April 2, 1982, overwhelming a tiny British garrison and expecting that Britain, facing economic troubles and reducing its navy, would negotiate rather than wage war for islands most Britons could not locate on a map housing only 1,800 people who raised sheep. Instead, Thatcher sent 2 aircraft carriers, destroyers, submarines, and troop ships that fought through naval battles, air attacks, and brutal ground combat across frozen hills to retake the islands in 74 days, demonstrating that Britain remained willing to project military power globally despite its reduced post-war status. Argentina lost the Falklands War not through a single catastrophic mistake, but through a series of miscalculations about British resolve, military decisions that squandered advantages, and fundamental weaknesses in training and logistics that professional British forces exploited ruthlessly. April 2, 1982. At dawn, Argentine special forces came ashore at Mullet Creek on East Falkland under cover of darkness, advancing toward the capital Stanley, where Governor Rex Hunt and a garrison of 68 Royal Marines prepared to defend Government House against an invasion force numbering more than 3,000 troops. The attack began with amphibious landings supported by Argentine naval vessels offshore as commandos moved through the outskirts of Stanley toward the governor's residence. By 9:30 in the morning, after brief resistance, during which 1 Argentine was killed and several wounded, Hunt ordered the Marines to surrender, recognizing that further fighting against overwhelming numbers served no purpose. Argentina controlled the Falkland Islands for the first time since 1833, and the military junta in Buenos Aires celebrated what appeared to be a bloodless victory that would unite a population angry about economic collapse and political repression. Argentina's invasion rested on assumptions that proved catastrophically wrong, beginning with the belief that Britain would not fight to recover islands so distant and economically insignificant. The military junta, led by General Leopoldo Galtieri, had watched Britain's defense budget shrink through the 1970s, seen the Royal Navy reduce its fleet, and noted Britain's announcement that it would withdraw the ice patrol vessel HMS Endurance from South Atlantic waters. These signals suggested Britain was retreating from global commitments and would accept Argentine sovereignty over islands Argentina called Las Malvinas, rather than wage war 8,000 miles from home. This calculation ignored fundamental aspects of British political culture and Margaret Thatcher's personality. Thatcher, who had become Prime Minister in 1979, promising to restore British confidence and reverse national decline, could not accept the loss of British territory to military aggression without destroying her political standing and Britain's international credibility. The Falkland Islanders, though numbering only 1,800 people, were British citizens who wanted to remain British and had the right to British protection, and the invasion violated international law's prohibition on acquiring territory through force, a principle Britain had fought World War II to defend. Within hours of the invasion, Thatcher convened her war cabinet and ordered the Royal Navy to prepare a task force to retake the islands. On April 5th, just 3 days after Argentine troops landed, the first British ships sailed from Portsmouth as crowds gathered to watch the departure in scenes that recalled Britain's imperial past. The task force eventually included 2 aircraft carriers, HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible, along with destroyers, frigates, submarines, amphibious assault ships, and requisitioned civilian vessels, including the cruise liner SS Canberra, converted to troop transport, and container ships modified to carry helicopters. Argentina began the war with significant advantages that competent military leadership might have exploited to make British reconquest impossible or prohibitively expensive. Argentine forces occupied the islands and could fortify positions before British forces arrived. Argentina operated from bases on the mainland just 400 miles from the Falklands, allowing aircraft to strike British ships and return to rearm, while British forces operated 8,000 miles from home bases with limited options for repair, resupply, or reinforcement. The Argentine Air Force possessed capable aircraft including super-étendard jets, equipped with French-made Exocet anti-ship missiles that posed serious threats to British vessels. Yet Argentina failed to leverage these advantages effectively. The troops garrisoning the Falklands were largely inexperienced conscripts, young men drafted for mandatory military service who lacked the training and motivation of professional soldiers. Many came from Argentina's northern provinces and were unprepared for the South Atlantic's brutal weather, suffering from cold and inadequate equipment as winter approached. Argentine commanders fortified Stanley but failed to adequately defend likely British landing sites elsewhere on the islands, allowing British forces to establish beachheads before attacking fortified positions. Most critically, Argentina's military junta believed that diplomatic pressure, particularly from the United States and Latin American nations, would force Britain to negotiate before the task force arrived, and that actual combat could be avoided. This wishful thinking meant Argentina did not mobilize its full military capability or prepare for sustained warfare. When fighting began, Argentine forces discovered they faced professional British troops with superior training, better equipment, and willingness to accept casualties that conscript forces could not match. The war's first major combat occurred at sea, as British submarines established a maritime exclusion zone around the Falklands and hunted Argentine naval vessels. On May 2nd, the British nuclear submarine HMS Conqueror detected the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano sailing south of the islands with 2 destroyers. The Belgrano, an American-built vessel that had survived the Pearl Harbor attack in 1941 when it served as USS Phoenix, posed a potential threat to British carriers if it coordinated with Argentine forces approaching from the north in a pincer movement. Conqueror fired 3 torpedoes at the Belgrano from a range of approximately 1,400 yards. 2 torpedoes struck the cruiser, causing massive explosions that tore through the hull and killed 323 Argentine sailors as the ship sank within hours. The sinking of the Belgrano, though controversial because the ship was sailing away from the Falklands when attacked, accomplished its strategic objective by convincing the Argentine Navy to withdraw its major surface vessels to port for the remainder of the war, ceding control of waters around the Falklands to British forces. Argentina responded 2 days later with an attack that shocked Britain and demonstrated the vulnerability of modern warships to precision weapons. On May 4th, 2 Argentine super-étendard jets launched Exocet missiles at British ships operating north of the Falklands. One missile struck HMS Sheffield, a Type 42 destroyer, penetrating the hull and starting fires that the crew could not control. The Sheffield burned for hours before being abandoned, eventually sinking while under tow on May 10th with the loss of 20 lives. The attack proved that Argentina could inflict serious damage on the task force despite British air defenses, raising questions in London about whether the operation could succeed without unacceptable casualties. The British landing at San Carlos on May 21st brought the war to its most dangerous phase, as Argentine aircraft attacked ships in what became known as Bomb Alley. Argentine pilots flew at extremely low altitude to avoid British air defenses, attacking ships anchored in San Carlos water with bombs and missiles. The attacks sank HMS Ardent and HMS Antelope, damaged several other vessels, and demonstrated remarkable courage by Argentine pilots who pressed attacks despite heavy anti-aircraft fire. Yet many bombs failed to explode because pilots released them at such low altitude that fuses did not have time to arm, a technical failure that saved British ships from additional losses. British forces established their beachhead at San Carlos Bay on the western side of East Falkland, landing 5,000 troops along with artillery, supplies, and equipment, while Argentine aircraft attacked the ships offshore in what British sailors called Bomb Alley. The landing succeeded because Argentine commanders had concentrated forces around Stanley on the assumption that British forces would assault the capital directly rather than landing elsewhere and fighting their way across the island, a defensive error that reflected poor understanding of British amphibious doctrine and gave British forces time to consolidate their position before beginning the advance towards Stanley. The British advance required moving troops and supplies across 50 miles of difficult terrain in bitter cold and mud, an operation complicated by the loss of helicopters when Argentine aircraft sank the container ship Atlantic Conveyor on May 25th with Exocet missiles, destroying vital transport and resupply capability. Without sufficient helicopters for transport, British troops had to march across East Falkland carrying heavy equipment, including ammunition, rations, and weapons weighing more than 100 pounds per man, while Argentine forces defended high ground overlooking Stanley. The campaign tested the endurance and discipline of professional British units, including paratroopers and Royal Marines, who were trained for exactly this kind of difficult operation but found the Falklands, weather and terrain as challenging as enemy fire. The first major land battle occurred at Goose Green on May 28th, when the 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment attacked Argentine positions defending the settlement. The battle demonstrated both British tactical skill and the costs of fighting determined defenders in prepared positions. British forces assaulted uphill against entrenched Argentine troops supported by artillery, suffering casualties, including the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel H. Jones, who was killed leading an attack on an Argentine trench system. The battle lasted 14 hours before Argentine forces surrendered, with the British taking more than 1,000 prisoners at the cost of 18 British dead and 64 wounded. The victory at Goose Green opened the way for British forces to advance on Stanley, but the final battles would be fought on high ground, overlooking the capital, where Argentine forces had constructed defensive positions. On the night of June 11th to 12th, British forces launched coordinated attacks on Mount Longdon, Two Sisters, and Mount Harriet, key positions in the ring of hills surrounding Stanley. The attacks began after dark, as British troops advanced through minefields and barbed wire under artillery fire, engaging Argentine defenders in close combat with grenades and small arms. The battle for Mount Longdon, fought by 3rd Battalion Parachute Regiment, became the war's bloodiest engagement as Argentine troops held positions among rocks that provided cover from British artillery and forced attackers into close-range fighting. British paratroopers suffered 23 killed and 47 wounded taking the position, facing Argentine defenders who fought with greater determination than expected. By dawn on June 12th, British forces controlled the high ground overlooking Stanley, placing Argentine positions in the town under direct observation and artillery fire. On the night of June 13th to 14th, British forces attacked the final ring of hills, including Wireless Ridge and Mount Tumbledown, that stood between them and Stanley, launching coordinated assaults designed to overwhelm multiple positions simultaneously and prevent Argentine commanders from shifting reserves to threatened sectors. The attacks employed the same night assault tactics that had succeeded on June 11th to 12th, using darkness to close with Argentine positions before defenders could bring effective fire to bear, and exploiting British superiority in night vision equipment and small unit coordination. The battle for Mount Tumbledown, fought by Scots Guards against Argentine Marine commandos who were among the better trained and motivated defenders on the islands, developed into savage close quarters combat among rocks and bunkers that lasted through the night, as both sides took casualties in fighting that resembled the trench warfare of World War I. By the morning of June 14th, British forces controlled all high ground around Stanley and had Argentine positions under direct fire. Argentine commanders, recognizing that further resistance would produce a bloodbath without changing the outcome, sought terms for surrender. General Mario Menendez, Argentine commander on the Falklands, met with British Major General Jeremy Moore and agreed to unconditional surrender of all Argentine forces in the Falklands. At 9 p.m. on June 14, 1982, the war ended with 11,313 Argentine troops laying down their weapons and British forces in control of the islands. Argentina's defeat resulted from multiple failures that reinforced each other to create conditions where British victory, though requiring skill and courage, became almost inevitable once the task force arrived. The fundamental miscalculation was believing Britain would not fight for remote islands, a mistake that reflected the junta's misunderstanding of British political culture and Thatcher's determination not to appear weak. Once Britain committed to reconquest, Argentina faced an opponent with superior professional military forces and willingness to accept casualties to achieve objectives. Argentine military leadership compounded the initial political error with operational failures throughout the campaign. The decision to garrison the Falklands primarily with conscripts rather than professional troops meant defenders lacked the training and motivation to match British forces in combat. Argentine commanders concentrated forces around Stanley, failing to defend San Carlos adequately and allowing British forces to establish a beachhead unopposed. The Argentine Air Force fought with skill and courage, but could not prevent British forces from landing and advancing because aircraft alone cannot control territory without effective ground forces to hold it. Logistically, Argentina's proximity to the Falklands proved less advantageous than expected because British submarines and air defenses made resupply dangerous while the Argentine Navy withdrew after the Belgrano's sinking rather than contesting British control of surrounding waters. Argentine forces on the islands struggled with inadequate cold weather equipment, insufficient ammunition, and deteriorating morale.
On Port Stanley in the Falkland Islands has taken place, and that Port Stanley is now occupied by Argentine military forces.
As conscripts endured conditions they were unprepared for, while professional British forces, though also suffering from cold and difficult terrain, maintained discipline and effectiveness. The quality gap between professional and conscript forces manifested in every engagement as British troops demonstrated superior night fighting capabilities, better small unit tactics, and willingness to press attacks despite casualties that Argentine defenders could not match. British officers and non-commissioned officers led from the front, exemplified by Lieutenant Colonel H. Jones dying while attacking an Argentine position, creating a culture of aggressive action that overwhelmed defenders who lacked comparable leadership. Argentine conscripts, many of whom had been in uniform for only months and received minimal combat training, found themselves facing elite British paratroopers and Royal Marines who trained specifically for the kind of difficult operations the Falklands campaign required. The international context also worked against Argentina as the United States, despite Latin American pressure to support Argentina, provided Britain with crucial intelligence, including satellite imagery and signals intercepts, allowed British use of facilities, including Ascension Island, for refueling and supply positioned halfway between Britain and the Falklands, and ensured NATO allies supported Britain rather than staying neutral. Argentina's military junta, which had committed human rights violations during the Dirty War that killed thousands of Argentines between 1976 and 1983, enjoyed little international sympathy, while Britain benefited from being seen as defending international law against aggression and protecting the rights of Falkland Islanders who wanted to remain British. The political consequences of defeat were swift and decisive. The military junta, which had invaded the Falklands partly to distract from domestic economic collapse and repression, could not survive military humiliation. General Galtieri resigned as president on June 18th, 4 days after surrender, and the junta collapsed within a year, leading to return of democracy in Argentina and trials of junta members for human rights violations. Britain, conversely, experienced a surge of national confidence as Thatcher's popularity soared, and the victory seemed to confirm that Britain remained a significant military power despite economic difficulties and decades of imperial retreat.
This one far down in the South Atlantic. Argentina today invaded and seized the Falkland Islands, which have been under British rule for nearly 150 years.
The Falklands War demonstrated that modern military conflicts between states could still be decided by conventional forces fighting for control of territory. That professional military training and discipline provided decisive advantages over conscript forces, and that political will and logistics matter as much as weapons technology in determining outcomes. Argentina's defeat teaches that military operations require not just initial success in seizing objectives, but the capability and determination to hold them against counterattack. That assumptions about enemy resolve can prove catastrophically wrong when leaders misjudge their opponents, and that professional military forces with clear objectives and competent leadership will generally defeat larger but poorly trained forces defending positions they were not prepared to hold. The war that began April 2nd, 1982, with Argentina's seizure of the Falklands, ended June 14th, 1982, with complete Argentine surrender, British reoccupation of the islands, and the collapse of Argentina's military government. The Falklands remain British territory today, defended by a permanent garrison and airbase that ensure no future Argentine government can repeat Galtieri's gamble. The war cost 649 Argentine lives, 255 British lives, and 3 Falkland Islander civilians killed accidentally by British fire, a relatively modest toll compared to other 20th century conflicts, but devastating for the families who lost sons, husbands, and fathers in a war that need never have been fought. If Argentina's leaders had understood that Britain would defend its territory regardless of cost or distance.